So today I have two goals in this modest talk. First, I want to tell you a little about Buddhism, and while doing so, make the case that at least for some of us, Buddhism can be considered agnostic. Secondly, I'd like to briefly compare the 7 UU principles with Buddhist teachings. Last summer I gave a talk where I spoke of my personal journey in being a non-theist and spoke about the ways UU helps us non-theists reap some of the benefits theists get from religion, such as ritual, although being Unitarian Universalist, not too much ritual, and most of all, fellowship. So let's now talk about Buddhism in relation to non-theism, more specifically agnosticism. Perhaps those of you who are also agnostics or non-theists might take some solace in the knowledge that the founder of one of the world's greatest religions also shared your not knowing about the gods and what happens after we die, and that there is indeed a 2,500-year-old tradition of agnosticism. I suppose I should begin with a quick summary of the basic teachings of the Buddha. We only have time to skim a few of the Buddhist teachings. The Four Noble Truths is the foundation of Buddhism. The first truth is that we all suffer. All beings suffer. Everything that changes brings suffering. Secondly, the causes of suffering are craving and ignorance. Now, we all know what craving is. We all know what it's like to lose something that we love or get something that we don't love. By ignorance, the Buddha didn't mean a lack of knowledge or education. Most educated people suffer. In Buddhism, ignorance is the inability to see things clearly as they really are. Conversely, wisdom is the ability to see ourselves and the world as it really is. The third noble truth is that there is an end to suffering. It can happen to anybody, anywhere, here and now. And the key to ending suffering is to remove desire, ill will, and ignorance. The fourth noble truth is about the path to reducing or eliminating suffering. The Noble Eightfold Path can only work if a person chooses to apply it to their lives and takes full responsibility for following the steps. The Eightfold Path is right understanding, right attitude, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Now, the last three, effort, mindfulness, and concentration, are about meditation. Now we can get to the fun stuff. Is it true that Buddhism, at its core, is agnostic? Now, based on what you may know about Buddhism, you may think that's a ridiculous question. Some of you have traveled to Buddhist countries and seen people bowing to statues, lighting incense, saying prayers, turning prayer wheels, and so on. But Buddhism is 2,500 years old. I want to focus on the teachings of the Buddha, not what humans have done with the teachings in the past several thousands of years. Like Christianity, Buddhism has splintered into many different schools of thought. Some schools even view the Buddha as a savior, and faith in the Buddha will lead to eternal salvation. Sound familiar? At the other end of the spectrum are schools like Zen that emphasize the practices the Buddha gave us as exemplified by the Eightfold Path. So, down through the ages, as Buddhism became more and more institutionalized, it began to lose some of its agnostic bent, but not all, thanks to Zen, if nothing else. So what are some of the teachings of the Buddha that can be considered agnostic? Well, the Buddha taught that we have no soul. You heard that right. The Buddha taught that the idea that there is some unchanged aspect of us, a soul, is an illusion because there's nothing in the universe that doesn't change. What else? Well, the Buddha made no claims to divinity. He worked no miracles. We don't know if the Buddha believed in the gods or not. He never said. What he did say was that he was about suffering and the end of suffering. He seemed to think that trying to understand the nature of the gods or what happens after we die is fruitless and a waste of effort. Here's one of the Buddhist sutras, quoting the Buddha. Suppose a man were wounded by an arrow thickly smeared with poison, and his friends and companions brought a surgeon to treat him. The man would say, "I will not let the surgeon pull out the arrow until I know the name and clan of the man who wounded me, whether the bow that wounded me was a long bow or a crossbow, whether the arrow that wounded me was hoof-tipped or curved or barbed." All this would still not be known to that man, and meanwhile he would die. So too, if anyone should say, "I will not lead the noble life under the Buddha until the Buddha declares to me whether the world is eternal or not eternal, finite or infinite, whether the soul is the same as or different from the body, whether or not an awakened one continues or ceases to exist after death." That would still remain undeclared by the Buddha, and meanwhile that person would die. So the Buddha presented himself not as a divine being, but as a man who discovered a path to reducing or eliminating suffering in this world. He never said that his path was the only path to end suffering. Today we see Christians and others from various traditions and non-theist practicing Zen with no dissonance against their own beliefs. So the Buddha didn't seem to care much about gods or life after death. So what about the Eightfold Path? Sounds a little like commandments, doesn't it? The Buddha divided human actions into skillful and unskillful actions. Skillful actions are actions that reduce or eliminate suffering, both for yourself and for others. Unskillful actions are actions that increase suffering for yourself and for those around you. The point is, there is no sin. No one is going to eternal damnation for not doing the actions in the Eightfold Path. They'll suffer more, and other people around them will suffer more, for they're not following the teachings, but they could still change their way and reverse their karma. Another point. I think Buddhism is the most scientific of religions. It does not, in the original teachings, represent a set of beliefs to be believed without question, but rather is a path of inquiry to arrive at truth. Sometimes when I ask my Zen teacher a question, he will say to me, "That would be an excellent inquiry." And rather than telling me the answer, he will give me hints about how to inquire. Now, I think one difference between science and Buddhism is that science studies the mind from the outside, and Buddhism studies the mind from the inside. But both Buddhism and science enter into their inquiries as openly and honestly as possible. A number of years ago, the Dalai Lama allowed his monks to have their brains studied scientifically while they meditated. So they had wires hooked up to their brains in every way imaginable, and they were studied. The Dalai Lama was asked, what would he do if the results of the scientific studies contradicted Buddhist teachings? The Dalai Lama replied, "We'll change our teachings." Can you imagine a leader of a theistic tradition saying such a thing? Finally, at least in Zen, which is the branch of Buddhism that I practice, not knowing is a virtue. Not knowing is a state of mind to be cultivated. Other religions want you to believe without question. Buddhism wants you to question. Suzuki Roshi spoke of beginner's mind. Zen master Song San called it don't know mind. Now, Stephen Batchelor has written a lot about agnostic Buddhism, and he's made the point that Buddhist agnosticism is often deeper than agnosticism many avow today. Today, when someone says they're an agnostic, it often goes hand in glove with an attitude that seems to not care about such things. I don't know what happens after death becomes equivalent with, I don't care. This attitude often lapses into skepticism. That's not the agnosticism of the Buddha. Now, Zen koans are designed partly to rid us of our logical, knowing minds, as well as perhaps the skepticism of apathy. Here's a koan featuring Bodhidharma, the granddaddy of Zen. Bodhidharma sat facing the wall. The second patriarch, who was his disciple, standing in the snow, cut off his arm and said, "Your disciple's mind is not yet at peace. I beg you, Master, give it rest." Bodhidharma said, "Bring me your mind, and I will put it to rest for you." The second patriarch replied, "I have searched for the mind, but have never been able to find it." Bodhidharma said, "I finished putting it to rest for you." Now, if you're scratching your head saying WTF, then the koan has done its job. They're maddening sometimes. It has brought us out of our logical, knowing minds. Perhaps this koan represents a deep not knowing. In this case, the second patriarch's inability to find his own mind, which takes the notion of agnosticism down to another depth, a contemplative depth. The second patriarch's cutting off of his arm removes not knowing from any kind of apathy or sense that the question isn't even worth asking. Let me end this segment with a quote from Stephen Batchelor that I think sums up the concept of agnostic Buddhism. The Buddha's teachings are confrontative. They're about truth-telling, not painting some pretty picture of life elsewhere. They're saying, look, existence is painful. This is what is distinctive about the Buddhist attitude. It starts not from the promise of salvation, but from valuing that sense of existential anguish we tend to ignore, deny, or avoid through distractions. The Four Noble Truths is something we can do. It starts with understanding the reality of anguish and uncertainty, and then applying a set of practices that work toward a resolution. This kind of agnosticism is not based on disinterest. It is a passionate recognition that I do not know. I really do not know where I came from. I do not know where I'm going. And that don't know is a very different order of don't know from a skepticism and fear of superficial agnosticism. This process of stripping away consolatory illusions by holding true to this agnostic not knowing leads to what we might call deep agnosticism. I like to think of Buddhism as deep agnosticism. So I only have a little time to talk about how Buddhism agrees with the UU principles. When I spoke to my Zen teacher about this talk and read to him the UU principles, his initial reaction was, of course. He basically said that these UU principles are the basis of Buddhism. Both Buddhism and Unitarian Universalism define religion as the search for truth and meaning, wherever that search may lead us. So let me quickly run down the principles and relay what Zen Master Bo Moon told me. The first UU principle affirms the worth and dignity of every person. Buddhism teaches that every human being, when the mind is clear and settled, has the capacity for basic human wisdom and compassion. When the mind is free of its programming, it is inherently clear and good. When I first began practicing Buddhist meditation, I was told repeatedly that I was practicing to reduce the suffering of all beings. I thought, well, the heck with that. I'm practicing to reduce my suffering. But as my practice deepened over time, I noticed that without any intention on my part, and probably despite my best efforts, I was becoming a little bit more compassionate and caring for others. I think that opening and softening of the heart is basic to Buddhist practice and speaks to the inherent worth and dignity of each person that Unitarian Universalism espouses. UU principle number 2 speaks of justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. Again, Buddhism teaches that the clear, calm, and open mind has the innate ability to see itself in others. Empathy is a key component to a sense of justice. Empathy takes justice out of the realm of the cold, uninvolved, and academic and makes it personal. Empathy and compassion animate our sense of justice. Principle number 3 speaks to acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth within our congregations. Acceptance of another and allowing them to be who they are is another foundation of Buddhist practice. The capacity to listen to another without judgment allows the heart to feel safe and to blossom. Many years ago, my Zen teacher was involved in creating the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy at Harvard. There were therapists there from many different therapy traditions, and he asked those therapists what was the most important principle they used in helping their patients. They all said that mindfulness and attention to self and other was the most important aspect. This radical no-fix therapy is inherent in Buddhism and in UU principle number 3. UU principle number 4 speaks of a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. This morning we sang a song based on a Buddhist sutra that says, "Be a light unto yourself." The Buddha taught that we should question everything according to our own experience, including his teachings. Of course, the Buddha taught that questioning might be guided by the Eightfold Path, which helps us see through our own hopes and fears. But the Buddha taught that we should not blindly believe a great teacher or a holy book. He said that holy books are like rafts that we can use to cross the stream. But once we reach the other shore, we should leave the raft or holy book behind in order to climb to the top of the mountain. To me, Buddhism exemplifies a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Principle number 5 relates to the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and at society at large. Suzuki Roshi was largely responsible for bringing Zen to the West, and he said that Zen is a kind of deep democracy and is a willingness to hear people openly and clearly. As for the right to conscience, Buddhism teaches that we have a requirement to live according to our values in order to live authentically. Otherwise, you're living according to someone else's plan for you. Principle number 6 relates the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Buddhism teaches that we can live in harmony when we live in a place of gentleness and concern for others. When I began practicing at the Shambhala Center in Lexington, I was told repeatedly that enlightened society depends on each of us individually. So I don't know that it is a goal of Buddhism to establish a world community with peace, justice, and liberty for all, but I do think that would be a result of more and more humans becoming more enlightened. UU principle number 7 speaks of respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. This is my favorite UU principle. I like the term interconnected web because it takes the supernatural aspect out of the question. The fact that everything in the world is connected and interdependent is a basic UU principle. A basic Buddhist principle. It's also a UU principle. The concept of karma, the cause and effect of everything on everything else, is based on universal interdependence. We're all in the same boat, us and nature. And on a very basic level, what happens to you happens to me. So that's about it for my very slanted view of Buddhism. To me, the Buddha's way is less about providing answers to life's questions and more about providing a path, looking beneath our hopes, fears, and ignorance to uncover our own basic wisdom, compassion, and joy. This is very much in line with UU principles. Perhaps the most honest answer to life's big questions is, I don't know. Let's all cherish and nurture our not knowing minds. Thank you for listening.